Great games at your table, and good evening. I am Jonathan Alvin, and this is Creative Differences. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that took me a long time to get to, and I only actually resolved this a couple of years ago, and although I still am an avid role player, I have officially ended my direct connection with Dungeons and Dragons, and I want to kind of explain why. Those of you that are on the Dungeons and Dragons channel, I understand this may be antithetical perhaps, but it's also my attempt at a wake-up call because I believe there's a major change that has happened over the last 50 years, and while it's taken me a while to get there, we really need to talk about it. So we're going to go into it in detail, and I've got some step-by-step explanations for how we've gotten to where we've gotten to and why I've taken the decision that I have. And near the end, we come up to the actual rubber meets the road part of it. But until we get to there, make sure that you go down below and hit all the buttons so that the algorithm will know that you're part of our audience. And let's get started, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame. Our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Alrighty, so before we get started, I want to tell a couple of stories, and perhaps you'll be able to pick up on some of the allegories from them. But let's start with this one. A young man, 7 or 8 year old child, is having problems with his parents in that they have not yet been able to figure out why he hasn't spoken. Now, they've put him through all kinds of speech therapists and physical therapists to make sure that there really isn't something physically wrong with the boy. As a matter of fact, the doctors can't find anything physically that would preclude him from being able to speak. And so they explained that maybe some people, develop at a slower pace and they should just give it some time. So they've tried everything. They've taken him to specialists. They've talked to psychologists and psychiatrists, and nothing's worked. So they decide to kind of take it easy and just go on with their lives. Well, one morning, the woman fixes breakfast for him and burns the oatmeal a little bit. And as the little boy starts to take a bite of his food, he makes a disgusting face and cries out, "This is really horrible. What's wrong with this?" And his mother is just surprised and rushes to his side and says, Why have you never responded before? We've been so worried about you. I'm so glad you're speaking, but why now?" And the little boy says, "Well, up until now, everything's been good." Additionally, there's the old phrase, which is in my title here, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And I've been a game master for 50 years, Dungeons and Dragons and other titles, but I have never made a decision to move away from a title before. Generally, I just play whichever game that we're collected to play and have really made no comment about it. But today, in the last 3 years, I've moved away from Dungeons and Dragons, and I never made an overt explanation piece by piece for why I made that decision. And today we're going to be looking at that in particular on a case-by-case basis. And each of these is, by its own right, a reason to not play Dungeons and Dragons. And I regret to say that only because it has been a venue that has really drawn a lot of great attention over the years and been really useful for adding players to the game, so I really can't complain. But these are the nuances that specifically have driven me to the point where Dungeons and Dragons is no longer one of the games that I GM. So, you may have heard this story as well, but I tend to use allegory. And again, this is another one for the specifics. And the idea here is that it is a a stated fact that if you try to put a frog in a boiling pot, they will react violently and come out back out of the pot. But if you put a frog in the pot and slowly turn up the temperature, they won't realize what's going on or will not respond to it and will actually remain there and pass away. Now that sounds like a horrible allegory, I suppose. But my point here is that myself and many of the other people who have been game masters and players over the years with Dungeons and Dragons have always known that there was something rotten in Denmark. There were things about the game that were problematic, but we didn't know how to resolve it or to face the specifics. And because there's been no solid explanation for what it was that was causing this problem, many players just continue to endure with the substandard play experience that they've been having without knowing why. And I'm hoping to, over the next few slides, kind of give you an idea of how we can actually recognize what's wrong with it and therefore make the changes necessary. So early on, Dungeons and Dragons was a mechanism whereby you would roll up a character in a numeric order. It was intentionally random. It wasn't specifically targeted to any specific purpose other than to build a random persona that you would then play in a game session. And the numbers you would roll would then choose for you or determine for you the class or the group that you'd be playing within. So if you rolled a high number for your strength, you were fundamentally destined to be some form of fighter. If you rolled up a higher than average dexterity, then you might be targeted to becoming a rogue, or if you had a high wisdom, you were intended to be a cleric, and the wizards, of course, came from a high intelligence. Well, these numerical values were intended to define for you a character that you would then move your personality into and then play into that role. But something happened, and I can't point to a finger to a specific year, but I know that mechanically what happened is many players were dissatisfied with this possibility. They would rather have played a game that would allow them to play the character that they specifically desired to play, which isn't really the same thing as role play. A great example, I suppose, would be if you took let's say you took a John Lithgow as an actor, and you looked at his stat block, then you determined that early on you wanted to put him in a constant role and only let him play that one kind of character, then you would be stifling his range and reducing his capacity to play other classes, to play in other positions. And a better example, I suppose, would be Conan, Arnold Schwarzenegger. You put him in a role where he's the big tough guy, guess what? He gets what they call typecast to only play really big tough guys. And so the numbers on the page would define who the character would be. But players got in a position where they only wanted to play a specific role, and the numbers sometimes wouldn't be commodious to this. Then if you had a high strength but you wanted to be a rogue, you might find you would be less effective as a rogue, and therefore you'd want to move your numbers around. And so over time, I'm not saying it was instantaneously, but over time, role play, the idea of playing a character as given to you and playing it to the best of your ability, was thrown out the window in favor of role play, which was to say, choose where you want your numbers to go and build the persona that you want to play, and then therefore you're going to be optimized for that role. And this concept of optimization, also known as min-maxing, became one of the primary ways players would pick which characters they were going to play. They would adjust their attributes and stats in such a fashion that they got to put the numbers where they wanted to and built out the character that they perceived that they wanted to play. Now, there is some call for that. Obviously, if you're not familiar with the idea of the clergy, and you're not aware of the propriety of playing a wizard, then obviously you'll want to play numbers that are more accommodating, and there's nothing wrong with that from a player standpoint, but there is from a game master standpoint, only because the players are not necessarily building to fit into the roles of the characters as you intend, or conversely, you have to then accommodate what the players have as their focus. And we'll get more to that in a moment. But in particular, what I want to talk about is the fact that this meant that the die rolling that happened in the game became more of a focus than the actual play of roles. Now, I totally understand that there are people who play role-playing games specifically as the game mechanic. They are just looking for gee whiz on what would happen with these personas in these roles, and therefore they want to give the best, or have the best player experience, if you will. But what I'm referring to is that from the standpoint of why Dungeons & Dragons no longer suits me is this emphasis on the numbers on the page over the identity of the person that is being represented is the issue for me. And I moved away from Dungeons & Dragons because I was more interested in the play of roles than I am on the idea of the play of the die rolls. And I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Are you more of a person that plays the character as written in the numbers, the order that they were rolled, or are you more of a pick the place you want to put them and run the attributes the way you want? It's just a different game because of that. Now, when we talk about class, the mechanism for Dungeons & Dragons, and I've done an entire video on the history of the roles of characters in roleplay games, and I'll put a link to that video right here. And we will then have a conversation perhaps about the various classes, but the structure by which the game came up with them was initially very open-ended. There was broad spectrum options for the players to decide how they played those roles. A person who was a rogue could be, a big tough guy, like a highwayman or a burglar, or perhaps he was more of a thug. The idea that the class that was then known as thief really covered a broad spectrum of types of criminals. The warrior, the fighter class, was broad. You could be a soldier, you could be a marine, you could be a local guard. There were all kinds of ways you could be the particular class, and there wasn't any hard and fast binding of what you could or couldn't do in terms of that. Now, each of these classes had a certain penchant. In other words, if you were a fighter, you were not given a spells list, for example. You weren't a spellcaster. You were not a magi. You weren't a cleric. And each of them was given these different differentiations to give them, perhaps as you might call it today, a cause to be in the party, but it was not intended to be a requirement. So in other words, an adventuring group could be all warriors, or a group could be all magi, and while you would want to have your group cover most of the spectrum, it wasn't imposed on you. As time went by, the classes became more like cages. In other words, if you were wanting to be, for example, a cleric, then you were limited to the weapons types you could use. You could wear armor, but you couldn't carry, for example, edged blades. That was one of the early jokes, was that if you had a fight between clerics, it would be pointless because, of course, they're clerics and don't have any weapons with points on them. But I digress. The idea here is that the classes over time became more and more intricate cages. Now, when we get all the way into the D20 period and later. So this is mid 80s into the 90s and beyond. Now the classes have been diversified so much that the lines blur. So you could be an arcane trickster, which means now you're a magic user and a rogue, or you are a arcane knight, and so now you are a warrior and a mage. And so the lines that clearly define them became even more of a cage, because then you'd be restricted into the little tiny boxes as far as which of these you chose to be, and you weren't able to expand your creativity or even imagine a possibility wherein you were a little bit of this and a little bit of that, because that was not optimized. That wasn't the you could not achieve the maximum abilities simply because the game limitations came down sort of like a hammer over time and really boxed up the different classes and the subclasses and the subclasses and the specialties, and the all of these limitations really scrubbed out the joy of imagination and creativity. You couldn't just literally play what you wanted to play. You had to play within these frameworks, and that became also problematic for the games that I have always run. Of course, there is the discussion of hit points and the very mechanism of roleplay games that has been pretty much constant for all of the years that I've been doing it. There has always been a challenge or a problem built into the mechanism because of its origin as a 1960s warfighting strategy. I've done a video on that. I'll try to find it and put a link up here for that as well. But the idea here is that in the case of those warfighting games, the mechanism for logistics pools became the abstract from which we got to the hit point pool. And although the hit points themselves are not very indicative of the way real living beings exist, nonetheless, it became the fundamentally the limitation that everyone had to play under, because there wasn't a way to express combat that didn't include a hit points pool. And that became more and more problematic. Now, with my development of, as I've described before, the NycosRPG system, that's changed over time, but it was difficult to overcome that in the years that I was a game master for Dungeons and Dragons. You simply had to find ways to either bypass the hit point pool or restrict the advancement, which of course leads to problems for the players. Or game masters had to change their style of play or become more sophisticated. And also, even either which way you look at it, the hit points become a problem because the players no longer fear the environment, because there's no longer a threat to their existence, which takes away from the drama and the dynamics and the excitement of a roleplay game altogether. But I digress. And when we're talking about role-playing games, one of the biggest challenges to me is that creativity becomes conformist. Now, there were reasons this was happening. The environment for role-playing was beginning to be parsed. There were new games coming into existence that were bounding on the boundary of traditional role-play environments, but now they were expanding into what if you have dragons and fighter aircraft? How do you deal with these mechanical differences? And Dungeons and Dragons, by nature, wanted to isolate its audience, and therefore their creativity was blocked in terms of advancement beyond certain cultural levels within the game, because they wanted to hold on to their intellectual property. The creativity became conformist in effect. And by that I mean, when you were a new world creator, you had to build the world that would use the very tools that were available in Dungeons and Dragons, and you it was downplayed the connection with other fantasy genres or even different frameworks within, because they would be using rules that weren't defined by the actual property. And this nature led there to be, for example, the concept that dragons are only 5 colors, and there are only 5 metallic dragons, and there has to be a defined way to, for example, connect with demons in game for those players that want to play warlocks and such, even if the game master had no concept of cosmology or connections with the outer planes and such. And so it became problems that you had to conform your creativity to the framework, or otherwise you weren't playing Dungeons and Dragons. You were, it's weird how there's an elevation and a denigration if you become involved with a homebrew, because either homebrew is your random weirdness which doesn't conform, or it's a way to isolate your players, and therefore it's also considered to be a bad thing as well. I think one of my biggest problems with it is that story becomes secondary, especially as the products advance over time. The game Munchkin is a great example of the trope of what Dungeons and Dragons had become fundamentally, and that was kick a door down, kill a monster, take its loot, move on to the next room. That became the trope and the mechanism for many people's roleplay experience, and so therefore the game master's extended story beyond those frameworks became secondary to the advancement of the personas. And this was also promoted by the redefining, and I think it was a weird push me pull you. The players were endeavoring to want to create their own story for their character, which the game promoted through backstories, but the backstories then became priority for the game master to weave that new developed backstory into their campaign, and therefore restricted their creativity and their ability to integrate the players with the world that they were playing. And therefore, by nature, that secondary story, that character persona backstory, now takes precedence. And as the properties of Dungeons and Dragons developed into the 2000s, into this century, so to speak, they basically undermined and fundamentally started to eliminate the necessity for a game master. And we've talked about that before, and I'll put again a video up here that I put together some time ago about the advancement of the backstory and the power play that was the D20 glut and the creation of Paragon level classes and new feats and new skills that drove the story basically out of the game and caused the game masters to fundamentally have to choose between having players at their game, but then making the stories match what the players had in their backstories, or to isolate their own story and therefore become perceived as a less fascinating game master. And either which way, there's now an imbalance where there seems to be fewer game masters, but I believe that part of that is that the players are now asking the game masters to play as it was what the characters want to do, not necessarily follow a story at all. And product-wise, this was in some ways a good decision made by a company from the standpoint of protecting their intellectual property by developing the mechanism for advancement that depends on feats, because the idea of adding new feats and new abilities was placed in the minds of the players in the properties that they were driven to. So the product that was being made for the players to build out their understanding of the world and to focus on the player instead of the game master. And this had everything to do with the reality that in any given games group you have 4 players and 1 game master. And as a product producer, do you want to produce a product that helps that drives just one purchase because the game master buys the product, or do you want to build something so that the players will build it? And with the advance of the D20 Glut and the opening of the original OGL and the D20 period, you had so many new products, new skills, new feats, new ways for a character to advance that a GM simply couldn't keep up with the potentials, because the players could go buy a new volume, and if you've got 4 players, that's 4 new books that you fundamentally have to have in order to play their characters as they want to play them, and that became problematic as well. It further, to me, was much more of the ROLL role-playing aspect as well, because these were all dedicated to make your persona have better advantages, for your persona to have new abilities that were unique, if you will, to them within the story, and that the game master would have to incorporate. And this therefore drove more game masters into the shadows, so to speak, because they simply couldn't keep up. And it's really no wonder there's fewer game masters than there were even a decade ago, because of the rapid onset of these player-focused advantages and player-focused products, and have put the game master on his heels, so to speak, in terms of what he wants to do with his game session. And in these death throes of Dungeons and Dragons, the last 2 or 3, 5 years, we've watched as they've attempted to isolate the intellectual property. There was the OGL scandal on whether or not they were going to shut down all intellectual use of their properties, whether or not they were going to modify or attempt to control the now apparently failed launch of Sigil to be the tool they wanted it to be, has really undermined the ability for that property to effectively brand itself. And I think that's really the thing that I find a challenge, is that Dungeons & Dragons, as originally branded, was here's a resource for you to tell your own stories. And over time it has become, no, you have to tell the stories we want to tell. And therefore we are going to isolate the monsters that we invented, and those are ours, and you can't use them unless you play your game within our framework. And the very concept of intellectual property for Dungeons and Dragons has automatically been sort of limited to the framework of the world of Faerun, the world of, for example, the Dragonlance saga, Greyhawk, and so on. Only those worlds that they had a hand in creating. But the irony is that the property that they built was specifically made for those of us that were actually building our own adventure worlds, and was not intended to be specifically isolated to their property. And so the irony is that they rolled out the rules of Dungeons and Dragons and worked really hard to make sure that everybody that created, at least during the D20 period, were actually building within their framework. And as time has gone by and they've realized that the framework is not what draws people, but the intellectual property that they are running in, all of a sudden now they're running behind the curve. If you think about Critical Role and the other properties that have come out in the last decade that are Dungeons and Dragons stories, D&D has done everything it can to basically put its claws around that property and try to control it. That's the reason why there was a module that was put out that was focused on the fantasy realm that Matt Mercer and his team had put together. There's a Rick and Morty's. Eventually, there'll probably be a SpongeBob. Who knows? But the idea is that they will take the Dungeons and Dragons mechanism and try to isolate as many intellectual property structures as they can, because that they feel is what's really powerful. And that's why the irony is that a property like NycosRPG is dedicated instead to being the intellectual property that is your freedom as a game master, and you're building your own story. You're not required or restricted by the mechanism to play any particular theme, although the genre materials are there to assist you in doing so. So it's for these reasons that I have moved away from Dungeons and Dragons, and why I eventually quit running Dungeons and Dragons, and I haven't run a D&D campaign as such in now almost 3 years. And it comes down to this, ladies and gentlemen: the idea of imagination trumps imitation every time. And so I would highly recommend that you play the world as you intend it as a game master. Create your own take on what culture is, what classes might be, what options the players might have. I recommend the NycosRPG mechanism simply because it provides that for you, so that you can get rid of the class structure. You're no longer bound by the hit point pool problem. And all of the issues that I've talked about are resolved therein. But the main thing is I want you to realize that the games that you have in your head, the creative power that you have, is really on your ability to imagine differently. And I want to help to do that with you. So check out NycosRPG. The property is now available in pre-release edition at the website here listed, and otherwise you can also check out for more information at NycosRPG.com, as well as our Patreon program if you want to become part of what we're doing at the patreon.com/Nykos, Nycos. You can join our community and actually play with us on our weekend games. We are endeavoring to create in that environment a live RPG online game that we'll be able to record for video, but we're not quite there yet. So if you are interested in becoming a part of that, check out NycosRPG.com or patreon.com/Nykos. Thank you again for being here, and as my grandfather would say, you had enough work today. Go play.